Welcome to another edition of R&R. If we haven't had the chance to meet him, my name is Kevin Barnett. I'm the youth minister here, and I'm just so honored to have this space to talk to you this evening about something that I'm really passionate about. And to really set the foundation of this, I want to talk about my family, which is easy to do. But if you don't know, my family and I, we uprooted from California and moved in the midst of a pandemic to this wonderful place that we call Texas. And it was crazy. And we have a 3-year-old and now a 1-year-old. And there were some crazy moments. We've moved here to a place that we didn't know anyone, that our closest family and friends are 1,500 plus miles away. And but we knew that God was doing something incredible in the midst of it. And on top of the moving, which you imagine would be pretty crazy, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And the 3-year-old is in the phase of the why, or what is that, or who is that stage of life. If you don't remember, it's when they want to point out everything in their vicinity, and they want to ask you what or who or why it is, how it is, whatever, which adds to some interesting conversations where you're trying to describe why the sky's blue, why science works, and all those fun things. But also becomes some really cool moments. Landon, who was my 3-year-old, he was having a little bit of a hard time with the move and stuff, and so my wife, the wonderful human being that she is, decided that she was going to make this photo album for him. And in the photo album, there was pictures of him with friends from California and family. And it was just for him to just look through when he was having a hard time in the very beginning. And so he was scrolling through his album, and he came across a picture of him with my grandmother, who has passed away. And he looked at the picture and said, "Who is that?" He was a baby at the time. And it was this really cool moment where I got to share about my grandmother to him. I got to share about how much she loved him, and how funny she was, and how incredible of a woman she was, and why we are the way that we are, because of the things that she instilled with us as children. And it was just this cool thing, and it just reminds me of how important it is to remember really important things, how cool it is, and how a lot of times it gives you that strength to keep going. And the Israelites, who we're going to talk about today, they go through very similar things in their story, countless occasions of them looking back and looking forward at God's faithfulness to lead them into their next season of life. And we're going to look at one of those today. And so we're going to be in the book of Joshua, chapter 4, and starting in verse 1, and it goes a little something like this. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. "Choose 12 men from the people, 1 man for each tribe, and command them, 'Take 12 stones from this place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing. Carry them with you and set them down at the place where you spend the night.' So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, 1 man from each tribe, and said to them, 'Go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you.'" And this might seem kind of in the midst of a story. It is. But the Israelites are in this huge transition, right? They're heading into this place that God had promised them long ago. And up to this point, they've been exiled. They've been roaming the wilderness for 40 years. And it's this crazy culmination as they're heading to this place, and yet, once again, the Israelite people hit a fork in the road, another hurdle that they're going to have to push through. Because when they got to the Jordan, it was flood season, and so the water was really high, and it was rushing super intensely. And imagine the disappointment on the Israelites, who are headed to this wonderful place, and yet there's this obstacle in the way, another obstacle in which God has to show up in a powerful way. And we know that God has an incredible plan for them, and so he does. The moment they step into the water, the sea stops, it breaks, and the whole thousands of people crossing the Jordan. And it's this incredible moment. And you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of parallels to the Red Sea. And the Israelites recognize that too, and it is. And so Joshua doesn't want to leave this moment. He wants us to go back and say, okay, how does this, this is important. And this is how he does this. He tells them to grab these stones. And I can't imagine the people are looking at this pile of rocks saying, well, what's the deal? What's the big idea? Because there's plenty of piles of rocks around the desert. And why is this any more special than the ones before? Well, it is super special, and it's because of this. We continue on, starting in verse 21. And Joshua, said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones? You should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, just as the Lord God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. What I love about this passage is that this moment in time isn't just for the Israelite people that are crossing the Jordan. What Joshua's saying here is that your children, your children's children, your children's children's children, obviously right now in this moment, we're still looking back at this moment to look at God's faithfulness. That this is a moment that's going to change the makeup of the Israelites forever, and it's going to change the way that they see God for generations to come. And they're able to share God's faithfulness. And it's because they remember. And when we remember what God has done, it helps us trust God even when we don't know what he's up to. That's the big idea here, is that when we remember what God has done, when we remember God's faithfulness, it helps us trust God even when we might not fully understand what he's got going on in that specific moment. Just like me telling my son about my grandma is going to continue her legacy moving forward, the Israelite people, by telling the story of God's faithfulness in this moment in the Jordan, is going to preserve and keep pushing God's legacy and his faithfulness to generations to come. And I like to think that people's faith were strengthened and people came to know who God was because of this pile of rocks at the base of the Jordan River here. You know, if you ever come into my office at the church, you'll see this picture on the wall, and it's this guy walking through nature, and there's this light shining through the trees, and it's something that I hold really near and dear to my heart because it's almost an exact replica of a vision that I think God placed in my life when I was a senior in high school, the moment I rededicated my life to Jesus. And so this is the thing that whenever I look at it in my office, it's a reminder of God's faithfulness, that he took this punk 18-year-old kid that thought he knew everything and called him into ministry and called him to something bigger than himself, called him home to relationship with God. And it's the same way these rocks have this value to the Israelites and even a value now to us as we look back and say, man, if God was faithful, right? If God can be faithful in these very real moments in life, then why is he not going to be faithful now? That's the important part here. And it doesn't mean that I'm perfectly trusting in God, that all I have to do is look at this picture and everything's like, poof, done. No. I still struggle to trust God in tough moments. But I would be lying to you if I didn't say that the moments of God's faithfulness don't cross through my brain when I'm going through tough things. I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that God reminding me, hey, there were moments where your bank account was at zero and I still provided for you in the midst of tough times. I'd be lying to you if that didn't happen. And it's because I remember, because I want to remember, because I want to believe that God is faithful and that he is going to do amazing things, whether it's what I think is right or not. And so before we end our time together, I want to get practical because I think it's so important that we can talk about these big things and like, yeah, I need to remember who God is. And that's great. We do need to do that. But how can we practically do that? How can we leave our time together and say, I have a set thing that I'm going to do? So I want to ask you, what are your remembrance stones? I'm going to do something visually, and I'm not asking you to pick up these heavy rocks that you're going to see in a second and bring them to a table. I'm not asking you to do that. But what I am saying is, hey, maybe you can grab a piece of paper and you can write down some of these things that remind you of God's faithfulness in your life. And some of your remembrance rocks are they might appear small to you. You might. I have one on here that says getting out of bed in the morning. You might think that's silly, but for some people that is a huge win, that God has worked in their life and given them another day to live, that they can go and do amazing things for the kingdom. And so just the fact that they woke up this morning is proof of God's faithfulness in their life. And other rocks might be really big. You might notice one very center. And I think it's the foundation of all of God's faithfulness. It's salvation. It's Jesus, right? When we were enemies to God, that God looked at us and said, no, I love you too much. The Israelites are a perfect example of that. They rebelled against God time and time again, and yet God said, I love you too much. He had a plan. And it came thousands of years after the fact, but Jesus came. God in a bod walked this perfect sinless life that we try to live. And when it was our turn to die or do death, Jesus taps us on the shoulder and said, no, I got this. I love you too much. That's what we believe. That's the ultimate sign of God's faithfulness. If God can love me at my worst and invite me into his family at my worst, he can accomplish anything. And there's other things on here, like moving and uprooting your family during a pandemic. That is an example of God's faithfulness. That's an example of plans that were set into motion years and years ago that God saw through. Maybe you've defeated an addiction or a sin, or you've seen someone come to faith. It's those moments that remind you that God is good and that he has this amazing plan for your life. And the last one I want to talk about is this, that maybe this faithfulness moment is you understanding for the first time that God's love for you. I like to say that you are God's beloved and there's nothing you can do to change that. And so when we truly wrap our brain around that, when we truly realize, man, I am loved by the God of the universe, things change. Your life has changed forever. And that's something you can remember time and time again. And so as you write down your list, and I want to encourage you to write down your list, I want you to put it somewhere that you walk by a lot. Maybe it's your fridge. Maybe it's your bathroom mirror. Maybe you fold it up and you put it in your wallet or your purse. Or maybe you put it in your office. But it's a thing that you can always look to and say, man, God is faithful. And you don't need to have 1,000 things written down. Maybe it's 2 things. Maybe it's 1 thing. That's amazing. Because God works in the small, in the mundane, in the small things, but he also works in the miraculous and everything in between. And I want to encourage you that it's awesome to talk about these things too. And so if you have a story to share, if you have a story to share about God's faithfulness, I want to hear about it. My email will be down at the bottom, and I would love to hear about God's faithfulness in your life. And maybe we can even post those things to encourage fellow believers in their walk with Christ. Because when we learn about God's faithfulness in others, we realize that God can do amazing things in our life as well. And so my hope and my prayer is that as you do this activity, that you might be encouraged. Because in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of being isolated at some points, we might lose sight of what God has done and what God is doing. And it's in those moments where we remember that we get the goosebumps and we get the reminder that God is still in control and that He's going to do incredible things on earth as it is in heaven. So Sugar Grove, I'm going to be praying for you this week. Thank you for allowing me to step into your space and let God speak through me to you this evening or whenever you're watching. And I just want to remember this, that if God is for us, who could be against us? Have a great week. Peace.